The alarm on my console screamed before I even understood what it meant. My name is Torin Kessa, and I was on watch duty aboard the Coalition cruiser Vantage Hold when the first signal came in. I remember the exact moment because my cup of warm nectar spilled across the console, and nobody, including me, cared enough to wipe it up. "Ensign Kessa, report," said Captain Mira Kess from behind me. Her voice was calm, but I had served under her for 3 years, and I knew the difference between her calm and her worried calm. This was the second one. "Distress signal, Captain. Weak. Coming from Colony Marrow Ridge." I pulled up the source on the main display. A small dot near the edge of Coalition space, tucked inside human-administered territory. "It's garbled. I'm cleaning it up now." The bridge went quiet, except for the low hum of the ship's systems. Marrow Ridge was not a large colony. It held maybe 6,000 people, mostly human families, who had moved out to the border to farm and mine and raise their children under a sky that wasn't Earth's, but was theirs all the same. It was not a military target. It was not important enough to attack. That was what worried me. "Play it," Captain Kess said. I ran the signal through the decoder. What came out was mostly static, broken words, a voice that cracked with fear. A human voice, a woman, saying something about lights in the sky and asking, over and over, for anyone to answer. Then nothing. The signal cut out mid-sentence. "When did this arrive?" the captain asked. 3 hours ago, ma'am. It took that long to reach relay range." She stared at the dot on the screen for a long moment. "And nothing since?" "No response to our hails. Nothing at all." Captain Kess turned to her communications officer, a tall Velen named Sura, who had 4 eyes and never seemed to blink all of them at once. "Try Marrow Ridge again, every channel." Sura's hands moved fast across her console. We waited. The silence stretched out longer than any of us liked. "No response, Captain," Sura said finally. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I had grown up on stories about the deep dark between stars, about pirates and storms, and the things that could go wrong on a lonely outpost. But those stories always had an explanation. A storm, a reactor failure, a miscommunication. This felt different, and I could not explain why. "Could be a relay malfunction," said Lieutenant Doss, our navigator, without much conviction. "Border colonies lose contact all the time. Bad weather, solar interference, equipment failing." "Marrow Ridge doesn't lose contact," Captain Kess said quietly. "Not in the 4 years I've had this route, not once." She was right. I had checked the logs myself more than once during quiet shifts, out of simple curiosity about the humans who lived out there, so far from their home world, so far from anyone who looked like them. Marrow Ridge sent a status report every single day, like clockwork, delivered by a young man named Oliver who ran the colony's small communications post. He always added a little joke at the end of his reports. It was a strange thing to notice, but I had grown fond of it. There had been no joke today. There had been no report at all. "Keep trying," the captain ordered, "and pull up the nearest outpost. I want eyes on this entire sector." I did as she asked, my fingers moving faster than my thoughts. The nearest human outpost was a small refueling station called Halden's Reach, 2 days away by fast courier ship, closer by long-range sensor sweep. I sent the query and waited for the automated systems to respond. Nothing came back. "Captain," I said, and my voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. "Halden's Reach isn't answering either." The bridge fell into a silence that felt heavier than before. 2 outposts, 2 silences. That was no longer a coincidence, and everyone on that bridge understood it at the same moment I did. Captain Kess stood from her chair. She was not a tall woman, not by human standards, or by the standards of most species in the Coalition, but she carried herself in a way that made rooms feel smaller around her. "Doss, plot a course toward the border. Sura, keep every channel open. Kessa, I want a full report on our fuel and supply status within the hour, and I want you to pull every record we have on Marrow Ridge and Halden's Reach. Population counts, defense capability, everything." Yes, Captain. I turned to my console, grateful to have something to do with my hands. The records came up slowly. Marrow Ridge held 6,211 people, according to the last census. It had no standing military presence, only a small local defense unit made up of volunteers, mostly farmers and traders, who had taken basic training. Halden's Reach was smaller still, a waypoint station with a crew of perhaps 200, meant to service passing ships and little else. Neither location had any strategic value that I could see. Neither location should have been a target for anyone. I brought the data to the captain's station and set it beside her. She read through it without speaking, her jaw tight. "There's something else," I said, because I could not help myself. "Captain, if I may ask, why does this feel different to you? We have lost contact with outposts before." She looked at me for a long moment before answering. "Because outposts that lose contact due to storms or equipment failure usually send one last garbled message about the storm or the equipment. That woman on Marrow Ridge said lights in the sky, Kessa. She wasn't describing a malfunction. She was describing something she saw coming. I did not have an answer for that, so I said nothing. Hours passed. The bridge crew worked in a tense quiet, broken only by the occasional beep of a console or the soft murmur of someone reporting a status update. I kept refreshing the communication logs every few minutes, hoping to see some sign, any sign, that Marrow Ridge or Halden's Reach had come back online. Each time, the screen showed the same thing: silence. Around the 4th hour, Sura called out from her station, her voice tight. "Captain, I'm picking up a partial burst transmission. It's old, it's been bouncing through relay stations for a while, but I think it's from Halden's Reach." "Put it through," Captain Kess said immediately. The audio crackled to life across the bridge, a man's voice, breathless, speaking fast. I could make out only fragments, something about ships that did not match any known registry, something about weapons fire, and then, right before the transmission cut, a single sentence that I would remember for the rest of my life. "Tell them we held as long as we could." The recording ended. Nobody on the bridge spoke. I looked around at my crewmates, at the Velen with her 4 unblinking eyes, at the navigator whose scaled hands had gone still over his controls, at the captain, who stood staring at the dead console as though she could will it back to life through sheer force of will. We were coalition officers. We had trained for combat, for emergencies, for the unexpected turns that came with life among the stars. But none of us had trained for this particular kind of dread, the kind that comes from hearing someone's last words and realizing you were too far away to help them. "Captain," I said quietly, "orders." She turned to face the bridge, and when she spoke, her voice had lost its calm and gained something harder. "Full alert. I want this ship at battle readiness within the hour. Sura, send a priority message to Fleet Command. Tell them we have lost contact with 2 human settlements under suspicious circumstances, and we have a partial distress transmission indicating hostile contact." "Yes, Captain," Sura said, already moving. "Doss, set a course for the border at maximum safe speed." "Course laid in, Captain." I stood at my station, waiting for my own orders, my hands clenched at my sides. The captain looked at me, and for just a moment, something passed across her face that I had never seen there before. It might have been fear. It might have been something else entirely. "Kessa," she said, "get me Fleet Command directly. Voice channel, not text. I need to speak to someone with authority, and I need to speak to them now." I turned to my console and began the sequence to open a direct line to Fleet Command, my fingers trembling slightly despite my best efforts to steady them. Behind me I could hear the captain pacing, her boots striking the deck in a slow, deliberate rhythm, like a countdown to something none of us could yet name. The channel connected. A voice on the other end asked for identification and clearance codes. I gave them both, my voice steadier than I expected. "This is Captain Mira Kess, of the Vantage Hold," the captain said, stepping up beside me and leaning toward the comm pickup. "We have lost contact with 2 human settlements near the border. We have evidence of hostile activity. I am requesting immediate reinforcement and updated intelligence on any threats operating in this sector." There was a pause on the other end, longer than I expected. When the response came, it was not from a low-ranking officer passing along routine information. It was from someone higher up the chain, someone whose voice carried the particular weight of a person used to being obeyed. "Captain Kess, hold your position and stand by. This situation has already been flagged at the highest levels. You are being redirected to rendezvous coordinates. Additional forces are being mobilized." "Additional forces from where?" Captain Kess asked. "Coalition fleet response time to this sector is measured in days, and we don't have days." Another pause. When the voice spoke again, it carried something I had never heard from Fleet Command before. Not confidence, not calm procedure, something closer to unease. "Not coalition forces, Captain," the voice said. "Human forces. They mobilized on their own the moment the second outpost went dark. We are still trying to get a clear picture of the scale, but early reports suggest it is significant." "Very significant." Captain Kess's eyes met mine across the bridge. I did not fully understand the weight behind that exchange, not yet, but I understood enough to feel the hair rise on the back of my neck. "Understood," the captain said slowly. "Send the coordinates. We're moving." The channel closed. For a moment, nobody on the bridge spoke. Then Captain Kess turned to the crew, and there was something in her expression that I had not seen in 3 years of serving under her. It looked almost like disbelief. "Doss," she said, "change course. New heading, on my mark." "Captain, what's happening?" I asked, unable to hold the question back any longer. She looked at me, and for the first time since the alarm had first sounded, I saw her hesitate before answering. "The humans didn't wait for us," she said. "They didn't wait for Fleet Command. They didn't wait for a formal declaration. They didn't wait for anyone's permission. The moment they lost a second outpost, they started moving ships. All of them. Every shipyard, every reserve fleet, every vessel they could arm and crew." "That doesn't sound like the humans I know," Sura said from her station, her 4 eyes blinking in a staggered, uncertain rhythm. "They're diplomats, traitors. They file requests in triplicate before they so much as adjust a shipping lane." "I know," Captain Kess said, and there was something in her voice that I could only describe as quiet dread. "That's what worries me." I turned back to my console, my mind racing through everything I thought I understood about our newest coalition members, and finding that none of it seemed to fit anymore. The humans I had studied in briefings were polite, cooperative, eager to prove themselves useful to species far older and more powerful than themselves. They asked permission, they followed procedure. They were, by every account I had ever read, the gentlest and most agreeable of all the coalition's member species. But somewhere out beyond the dark edge of the viewport, past the stars I could see and the ones I could not, something had happened to change all of that in the span of a single day. "Set the new course," Captain Kess said, her voice steady once more, though I could hear the effort it took to make it so. "We're not just responding to an attack anymore. We're walking into the middle of whatever the humans are about to do." I looked at the viewport, at the endless dark, scattered with distant light, and I felt, for the first time in my career, truly and completely afraid of what we might find at the end of our journey. "Aye, Captain," I said, and turned back to my station, because there was nothing else left to do but move forward into the unknown. We reached the rendezvous point 6 hours later, and I had spent nearly every one of those hours reading everything I could find about human military history. It was not a habit I had before that day, but something about the voice on the recording, the fear in it, the strange calm resolve underneath the fear, made me want to understand these people better before I met them again in whatever came next. What I found in the archives surprised me. The humans had only been part of the coalition for 11 years. Before that, they had been a single species confined to a single solar system, with no knowledge that other intelligent life existed anywhere in the galaxy. When first contact happened, it had been coalition scouts who found them, not the other way around, and the reports from that period painted a picture of a species eager to learn, quick to adapt, and remarkably willing to set aside their differences in order to join a much larger community of worlds. They had been given a place near the bottom of the Coalition's informal hierarchy, not through any cruelty, but simply because that was where new species always started. They performed logistics work. They crewed supply lines. They handled diplomatic outreach to other new species who might be nervous about joining an alliance of beings who looked nothing like them. Humans, it turned out, were remarkably good at making frightened strangers feel comfortable. I found records of joint exercises between human ships and Coalition ships, and the reports were almost uniformly positive, if slightly condescending in tone. Human tactics were called creative but undisciplined. Human ship designs were called resourceful but crude. Human soldiers were called brave but reckless. Every report seemed to carry the same underlying message, spoken or unspoken. They try hard, and someday, with enough training from the older species, they might become truly capable. I brought a summary of my findings to the officers' briefing room, where Captain Kess had gathered the senior crew along with 2 other Coalition ship captains whose vessels had joined our formation during the journey. One was an older Velen commander named Rask, gruff and quiet, who had served in the Coalition fleet for longer than I had been alive. The other was a young Threll officer named Vessa, sharp-eyed and eager, still new enough to her post that she asked more questions than the others were comfortable with. "So the humans are new," Vessa said, once I had finished my summary. "New and, by every account, not particularly strong on their own. So why is Fleet Command treating this like it's the beginning of a full-scale war?" Captain Rask, the older Velen, made a low sound in his throat that might have been a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Because Fleet Command remembers something the rest of you don't." The room went quiet. Captain Kess turned to him. "Remembers what, exactly?" Rask was silent for a moment, his heavy hands folded on the table in front of him. When he spoke, his voice had dropped low, the way voices do when people are about to say something they have been asked not to say. "There is a reason the older species in this Coalition go quiet whenever the humans come up in serious conversation. It isn't respect, not exactly. It isn't fear either, not in the way you're imagining. It's memory." "Memory of what?" I asked, unable to stop myself. Rask looked at me, and something in his expression made me wish I had stayed silent. "You've heard of the Threll incursion, I assume, 200 years ago, before your grandparents were born, before mine either." Vessa straightened at the mention of her own species' name. "I've read about it. The Threll made a play for territory along an unclaimed border region. It's in every history text. They were repelled, and the matter was settled through diplomatic channels. That's the official record," Rask said. "It is also, I am sorry to tell you, not entirely true." Captain Kess leaned forward. "Rask, if you know something relevant to our current situation, I need to hear it. All of it." Rask exhaled slowly, as though the words themselves carried weight he did not want to lift. "The Threll incursion was not repelled through diplomacy, not at first. What actually happened is that the Threll made contact with a small, isolated colony that had broken away from the main body of Coalition territory generations earlier, a colony that had, by pure coincidence, been founded by early human settlers who left Earth long before official first contact ever happened. Nobody in the wider Coalition even knew they existed. I felt a chill settle over the room. Nobody spoke. The Threll didn't know either," Rask continued. "They found what looked like an easy target, undefended, unaffiliated, no military support anywhere nearby. They moved to claim the territory the same way they had claimed a dozen others before it, and for reasons that were never fully explained in any official report I have ever seen, the humans there did not surrender, did not negotiate, and did not wait for help that was months away. They fought, and when the fighting was over, the Threll fleet that had come to claim an easy colony no longer existed." Vessa's mouth had fallen slightly open. "That's not in any history I've read." "It wouldn't be," Rask said. "The Threll government of the time made sure of that, out of understandable embarrassment, and the Coalition at large agreed to let the matter fade from official record because nobody wanted to explain how an unaffiliated colony of a species, nobody had even catalogued yet, had managed to destroy a Threll invasion fleet with nothing but improvised defenses and sheer stubbornness. When formal first contact happened with the wider human species decades later, only a small circle within Fleet Command ever connected the two events. It has been treated as classified history ever since. A cautionary tale passed quietly from commander to commander, never written down where anyone knew could find it. The briefing room was silent for a long moment. I found myself thinking of the young man named Oliver, the communications officer at Marrow Ridge, who added a small joke to every status report he sent. And I wondered whether he was still alive, and whether the same stubbornness Rask had just described was somewhere inside him too. "So what you're telling us," Captain Kess said slowly, "is that the reason Fleet Command is treating this as an emergency of the highest order isn't because they're worried about what the unknown attackers might do to the humans." "No," Rask said. "It's because they're worried about what the humans are about to do to the unknown attackers, and they have no way of controlling it once it starts." Vesa let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "With respect, Captain Rask, I've served alongside human crews. They're polite. They apologize when they bump into you in a corridor. I once watched a human ensign spend 20 minutes trying to catch a small insect in a cargo bay so he wouldn't have to kill it." "I don't doubt any of that," Rask said. "I've served with them too, and everything you're describing is true. They are, in ordinary circumstances, among the gentlest people I have ever known. That is exactly what makes this so unsettling. A species capable of that kind of patience and gentleness does not become what the old records describe without an enormous and specific kind of provocation. And once that provocation happens, once it truly happens, that same gentleness seems to convert itself into something else entirely. Something focused, something that does not stop simply because an enemy asks it to. I thought about the recording again. Tell them we held as long as we could. I thought about 6,211 people on Marrow Ridge, about a woman's voice cracking with fear as she described lights in the sky, about a young man who always ended his reports with a small joke. "How many ships," Captain Kess asked quietly, "did the humans mobilize?" Rask shook his head. "Fleet Command isn't sure yet. Every estimate that comes in is higher than the one before it. Shipyards that were supposed to be operating at partial capacity for scheduled maintenance are reporting full production. Reserve fleets that haven't been activated in years are suddenly crewed and moving. Civilian vessels are being converted for support roles faster than anyone thought possible. It is, by every measure Fleet Command has, an entire species turning itself toward a single purpose in a matter of hours, rather than the weeks or months such mobilization should require." "That should be impossible," Vesa said. "No species organizes that quickly, especially not one with as little formal military infrastructure as the humans have." "And yet," Rask said simply, "here we are." Captain Kess stood from the table and walked to the small viewport at the end of the briefing room, staring out at the stars for a long moment before she spoke again. "Our orders are to escort the coalition relief convoy toward the border and coordinate with whatever forces we find there. I want everyone in this room to understand something before we proceed. We are not going into this situation as the primary force. We are going in as support to a species that, until this morning, none of us fully understood. I want every officer under my command to treat that fact with the seriousness it deserves. No assumptions, no condescension, and no mistakes." "Understood, Captain," Vesa said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. I stayed behind after the others left, still turning Rask's story over in my mind. He noticed me lingering and paused at the door. "You have a question, Ensign," he said. It wasn't a question itself, just an observation. "The colony that fought off the Threll fleet," I said. "What happened to it afterward? Did anyone ever go back to check on the survivors?" Rask's expression softened, just slightly. "They rebuilt. Quietly, without fanfare, the way humans seem to do most things when nobody's paying attention. Some of their descendants are probably serving in the very fleet that's mobilizing right now, though none of us will ever know which ones. That's rather the point of it being erased from the record, Ensign. The humans themselves may not even know their own history that well. but something in them remembers, even if the memory isn't written down anywhere official. He left me alone in the briefing room with my thoughts and the quiet hum of the ship around me. I stood at the viewport where Captain Kess had stood only minutes before, looking out at the same stars, and I tried to imagine what kind of species could carry a memory that deep without ever needing to write it down. 3 hours later, the convoy reached the edge of human-administered space, and every question I had was about to be answered, whether I was ready for the answers or not. The moment we crossed into the border sector, my sensor console lit up with more contacts than I had ever seen in one place in my entire career. Ship after ship after ship, arranged in formations that did not match anything in the Coalition tactical database, spreading out across the sector like a wall being built in real time. "Captain," I said, my voice catching slightly, "you need to see this." Captain Kess crossed the bridge in 3 quick strides and looked over my shoulder at the display. For a long moment, she said nothing at all. Neither did I. There was nothing simple enough to say. What we were looking at was not a rescue operation. It was not even, strictly speaking, a military response in any form the Coalition had trained us to recognize. It was something else, something larger and stranger, and far more focused than anything in our briefings had prepared us for, and it stretched from one end of my sensor range to the other without any sign of slowing down. "Sura," Captain Kess said quietly, "open a hailing channel to the nearest human vessel. I think it's time we introduced ourselves properly." The channel connected faster than I expected. A woman's voice came through, clipped and efficient, with none of the polite warmth I had come to associate with human communications. "This is Lieutenant Laura Bennett, Human Border Defense Fleet, Vessel Meridian's Edge. Identify yourselves and state your intentions." Captain Kess stepped up to the comm pickup. "This is Captain Mira Kess of the Coalition cruiser Vantage Hold, leading a relief convoy toward Marrow Ridge. We're here to assist however we can." There was a pause on the other end, brief but noticeable. "Copy that, Vantage Hold. Recommend you hold formation at the edge of the sector until further notice. Things are still moving fast out here, and we don't want friendly ships caught in the wrong place." "Lieutenant, can you give us a status update?" Captain Kess asked. "We lost contact with Marrow Ridge and Halden's Reach nearly 9 hours ago." Another pause, longer this time. When Bennett spoke again, her voice had softened just slightly, enough that I could hear the exhaustion underneath the professionalism. "Marrow Ridge is still standing, barely. Halden's Reach took heavier damage, but the garrison held the main structure. We're working on getting relief supplies through, now that the immediate threat has been pushed back from both locations." "Pushed back to where?" I asked, before I could stop myself. Captain Kess glanced at me but did not reprimand the interruption. "That's the part I can't answer over an open channel," Bennett said. "Stand by. I'm sending a shuttle to bring your captain and senior staff aboard the Meridian's Edge for a proper briefing. It'll be faster than trying to explain all of this through comms." The shuttle arrived 20 minutes later, a sleek, fast little craft that moved with a precision that surprised me given everything Rask had told me about human ships being crude and improvised. Captain Kess selected me along with 2 other officers to accompany her, and I found myself sitting in the shuttle's cramped passenger compartment, watching through a small viewport as we approached the human fleet. Up close, the scale of what the humans had assembled was even harder to comprehend than it had been on my sensor display. Ships of every size and design imaginable moved in coordinated patterns across the sector, some clearly military vessels built with purpose, others just as clearly converted from civilian use, their hulls still bearing the faded markings of cargo companies and passenger lines. And yet, despite the mismatched origins, there was an unmistakable order to how they moved. Nothing about it looked crude. It looked like a machine built out of whatever parts were available, running with terrifying efficiency regardless. We docked aboard the Meridian's Edge, and I stepped off the shuttle into a corridor that smelled faintly of coffee and recycled air, a smell I would come to associate with humans for the rest of my life. The ship's interior was utilitarian, unadorned, built for function rather than comfort, and everywhere I looked, crew members moved with quick, purposeful steps, none of them wasting motion, none of them raising their voices. Lieutenant Bennett met us at the airlock. She was younger than her voice had suggested, with tired eyes and hair pulled back in a hurried knot, wearing a uniform that looked slept in. She offered a brief, tired smile as she shook Captain Kess's hand, a human custom I had read about but never witnessed in person. "Thank you for coming," Bennett said. "Colonel Cole is waiting in the briefing room. He'll walk you through everything." She led us through the ship, and I found myself studying everything around me with the same curiosity I had once reserved for archive records. Every surface was clean but worn. Every piece of equipment showed signs of recent, hurried use. On one wall, I noticed a handwritten sign taped up near a supply locker, listing names and blood types, and beneath it, someone had added a small, hand-drawn symbol I did not recognize, something that looked almost like a flower. "What is that?" I asked Bennett, nodding toward the sign. She glanced at it, and something flickered across her face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "That's for the crew from Halden's Reach. We pulled off during the evacuation. Some of them didn't make it. We keep a list so nobody's forgotten while things are still moving fast enough that we can't stop and properly grieve yet." I did not know how to respond to that, so I said nothing, and we continued walking in silence until we reached the briefing room. The man waiting for us inside was tall, with close-cropped dark hair going gray at the temples, and the kind of stillness in his posture that comes only from a very particular sort of tiredness, the kind that goes beyond a single sleepless night. He introduced himself as Colonel Ethan Cole, and when he shook Captain Kess's hand, I noticed that his grip lingered a moment longer than the gesture required, as though the simple human contact of it was steadying him somehow. "Captain Kess," he said, "appreciate you getting here as fast as you did. I know Coalition protocol usually calls for a lot more paperwork before ships start moving. These weren't ordinary circumstances." Captain Kess said, "Colonel, I need a clear picture of what happened here, and what's still happening." Cole gestured toward the display table at the center of the room, and an image resolved above it, a tactical map of the sector showing ship positions, threat markers, and colony locations. 3 days ago, an unidentified force crossed into this sector and made contact with Marrow Ridge. No warning, no communication, no demands. They opened fire on civilian infrastructure within the first hour. Local defense held them off long enough to get a distress call out, but by the time we got hard confirmation back on Earth, they'd already moved on to Halden's Reach. "Who are they?" I asked. "The attackers, I mean." Cole looked at me for the first time since we had entered the room, his eyes taking a brief measure of me before he answered. "We're calling them the Skarn Compact. New to us, not new to the Coalition from what I understand. Some kind of expansionist faction operating outside official Coalition territory, looking for easy targets along the border where response times are slow and defenses are thin. And you responded within hours," Captain Kess said. It wasn't quite a question, but Cole answered it as one. "We didn't have a choice," he said simply. "By the time official Coalition channels processed the threat assessment and started drafting a formal response, we'd already lost contact with 2 settlements and didn't know how many more were about to go dark. Earth doesn't wait for permission when its own people are in danger. I don't say that as a criticism of your procedures, Captain. I say it because it's simply true of us, and I'd rather you understand that now than be surprised by it later." Captain Kess studied him for a long moment. "How many ships have you committed to this response, Colonel?" Cole's jaw tightened slightly. "More than I'm cleared to tell you the exact number of, Captain, but I'll say this much. Every shipyard on Earth and in every human colony within a week's travel of here switched to full production the moment the second distress call came in. We activated every reserve fleet we have. We called up volunteers we hadn't trained in years. People left their jobs, their families, their lives, and showed up at recruitment stations within hours of the news breaking, faster than any of our own logistics teams could process them. That's not standard mobilization procedure for any species I've studied," I said, unable to hold back the observation. Cole's expression shifted, something tired and a little sad moving behind his eyes. "No, I don't imagine it is. But you have to understand something about us, Ensign. Most species in the Coalition, and I mean this with respect, not insult, have been part of a larger community for a very long time. You've had generations to grow comfortable, to trust that if something goes wrong, someone else will step in eventually, that the structures in place will hold. We haven't had that luxury. Until 11 years ago, we were completely alone. Everything we have, we built for ourselves, out of necessity, out of the simple fact that nobody was coming to save us if we didn't save ourselves first. That kind of history doesn't just disappear because we joined a coalition. It's still there, underneath everything, and when people we're responsible for are in danger, it comes right back to the surface. I found myself thinking of Rask's story, of the isolated colony that had fought off an entire invasion fleet with nothing but improvised defenses and refusal to surrender, and I understood, finally, that what Cole was describing was not new behavior at all. It was the oldest behavior humans had. "What's your current tactical situation?" Captain Kess asked, steering the conversation back toward practical matters. "Where is the Skarn compact fleet now?" Cole gestured, and the display shifted to show a cluster of red markers near the edge of the sector map, retreating slowly toward what looked like a staging point deeper in unclaimed territory. "We pushed them back from both colonies. They're regrouping here, at a station we believe they've been using as a forward base for weeks, possibly longer. Our scouts have been gathering intelligence on the location for the last several hours. You're planning to strike the staging point directly," Captain Kess said. "Yes. That's a significant escalation, Colonel. If this Skarn compact has allies, or if this staging point is more heavily defended than expected, you could be walking into a situation far worse than the one you're trying to end." Cole met her gaze steadily. "I understand the risk, Captain, but I also understand what happens if we don't act. This isn't the first time the Skarn compact has attacked a border settlement. It's simply the first time they've attacked one of ours. Intelligence suggests they've hit at least 4 other undefended coalition outposts over the past year, all quietly, all far enough from major fleet routes that nobody outside the immediate region ever heard about it. If we don't push them back hard enough that they understand attacking human settlements carries a cost they can't afford, they'll simply try again somewhere else, against people who might not survive it as well as Marrow Ridge did." Captain Kess was quiet for a long moment, weighing his words. Finally, she nodded. "The Coalition Relief Convoy is prepared to support your operation in whatever capacity is useful. Medical assistance, supply logistics, additional firepower if your commanders think it would help rather than complicate your formations." "I appreciate that," Cole said, and for the first time since we had entered the room, something like real warmth entered his voice. "I know this hasn't been an easy day for anyone, coalition or human. I want you to know that we don't take your support lightly, Captain, and we don't intend to put your people at unnecessary risk in an operation that's ours to see through." As the briefing continued, working through logistics and coordination details, I found myself watching Cole rather than listening to every word. There was something in the way he carried himself, calm and measured on the surface, but with an undercurrent of something else entirely, something focused and unshakable that reminded me less of the polite, eager to please humans I had read about in old briefings, and more of a mountain that had decided to move. When the meeting ended and we made our way back toward the shuttle bay, I fell into step beside Bennett, who had stayed close throughout the briefing without saying much. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Sure," she replied. "Are you afraid? Of what's coming next, I mean. The attack on the staging point." Bennett considered the question for a moment before answering. "Afraid isn't really the word for it. I think most of us stopped being afraid somewhere around the time we heard what happened at Marrow Ridge. What's left after the fear passes isn't a comfortable feeling exactly, but it's not fear either. It's just resolve. Like something in you decides the outcome doesn't matter as much as making sure you tried everything you had." We reached the shuttle bay, and as Captain Kess prepared to board, I glanced back down the corridor toward the briefing room, where I could just make out Colonel Cole through the open doorway, standing alone for a moment before the next wave of officers arrived, his hand pressed flat against the display table, his head bowed slightly, as though gathering himself before whatever came next. I turned to Captain Kess, who had been watching the same scene. "Captain," I said quietly, the words settling into place with a weight I had not expected. "It's the humans, and they're not happy." She looked at me, and something in her expression told me she had been thinking the exact same thing for the last several hours, waiting for someone else to finally say it out loud. "No, Ensign," she said, "they're not, and I don't think anything in this galaxy is quite ready for what that means." The shuttle doors closed behind us, and as we pulled away from the Meridian's edge, I watched through the small viewport as the enormous, mismatched, terrifyingly organized human fleet continued its slow, silent advance toward whatever waited at the edge of the sector, and I understood, in a way I never had before, why the older species of the Coalition went quiet whenever the subject of humans came up in serious conversation. It was not fear of what humans could do, it was fear of what humans would do once they had decided it needed doing. The fleet moved out 12 hours later, and I watched it happen from the bridge of the vantage hold, positioned near the rear of the formation alongside the rest of the Coalition relief convoy. Captain Kess had negotiated our role carefully with Colonel Cole. We would provide medical support, hold reserve supply lines, and stay ready to assist any human vessel that took damage during the operation. We would not lead the assault. This was not our fight to lead, and everyone on our bridge understood that, even if some of us privately wished we could do more. The staging point, once we reached visual range, turned out to be a repurposed asteroid facility, hollowed out and fortified, bristling with defensive weapons platforms and surrounded by a screen of Skarn compact warships arranged in a formation that looked, even to my untrained eye, formidable. I ran the numbers through my console and felt my stomach tighten. The defenders outnumbered the initial human strike force nearly 2-1, with heavier individual ship classes and what appeared to be a functioning planetary-style shield generator protecting the facility's core. "Captain," I said, "the defensive formation looks significant. I'm reading shield strength consistent with a hardened military installation, not a temporary staging point." Captain Kess studied the display without expression. "Send that assessment to Colonel Cole's tactical staff. I imagine they already know, but it doesn't hurt to confirm." The response came back within minutes, relayed through Sura's console. "Human forces acknowledge assessment, proceeding as planned." "Proceeding as planned," Sura repeated, a note of disbelief in her voice. "Captain, their planned approach doesn't match anything in standard Coalition tactical doctrine. They're not forming a concentrated strike line. They're spreading out." I pulled up the formation data myself and saw what she meant. Rather than massing their ships into a single overwhelming force the way Coalition doctrine would have suggested, the human fleet was dispersing into dozens of smaller groups, each moving on a different vector, converging toward the staging point from every possible angle at once. "It's chaotic," Doss muttered from the navigation station. "There's no central concentration of force. Any Coalition tactical instructor would fail a cadet for proposing a formation like that." "Maybe," Captain Kess said quietly, watching the display with an intensity I had rarely seen from her. "Or maybe it's not chaos. Maybe it's something we don't have a framework to recognize yet." The battle began without any formal declaration, without any dramatic opening exchange of fire that I might have expected from the old stories I had read as a child. One moment the human fleet was approaching in its strange, scattered formation, and the next, the Skarn compact defensive line opened fire, and the sector around the staging point erupted into a storm of energy weapons and defensive countermeasures. I had seen Coalition fleet engagements before, training exercises and the rare real conflict, and they had always followed a certain rhythm, a back-and-forth exchange governed by clear tactical principles that made the flow of battle at least somewhat predictable to an experienced observer. What I watched unfold around the Skarn staging point followed no such rhythm at all. The scattered human formation, which had looked so vulnerable only minutes before, began converging on individual Skarn vessels with a speed and coordination that seemed almost impossible given how spread out they had been. Ships that had appeared to be operating independently suddenly moved in perfect concert, overwhelming isolated defenders 3 and 4 at a time before rapidly redistributing to strike elsewhere. It was less like watching a battle and more like watching a single organism attack from 100 directions at once, each part moving independently, yet somehow perfectly informed of what every other part was doing. Their coordination, I said, watching the tactical display with growing astonishment. Captain, I don't understand how they're managing this level of coordination. Our own fleet communication systems would introduce enough delay to make this kind of synchronized movement impossible. I don't think they're relying purely on formal communication systems, Captain Kess said slowly. Look at the pattern. It's not perfectly synchronized. It's adaptive. Each group is reading the battlefield and adjusting on their own, but somehow arriving at complementary decisions without needing to be told what to do. I did not have an explanation for that, and neither, it seemed, did any of the tactical analysis systems on our own ship, which struggled to model the battle's progress with any real accuracy. Every prediction our systems generated fell apart within minutes, as the human fleet did something unexpected, something that should not have worked by any conventional measure, and yet somehow did. The Skarn Compact's defensive line, so formidable in its initial arrangement, began to fracture under the pressure. I watched one of their heavier warships attempt to retreat toward the facility's shielded core, only to find its path cut off by 3 smaller human vessels that had somehow anticipated the retreat and repositioned to block it minutes before the Skarn ship's own crew had apparently decided on the maneuver. They're not just fighting reactively, Sura said, her voice hushed with something close to awe. They're anticipating. Every move the defenders make, the humans seem to already have a response prepared. Hours passed in this manner, the battle grinding forward in fits and starts, the Skarn Compact's forces steadily whittled down despite their initial numerical and technological advantage. Our own crew monitored the medical and supply channels constantly, ready to assist wherever we were needed, and more than once we dispatched shuttles carrying emergency supplies to human vessels that had taken damage but refused to withdraw from the fight. I remember one exchange in particular, relayed to our bridge through an open tactical channel that Sura had been monitoring. A human ship, badly damaged, its shields failing, had been ordered by a squadron commander to fall back and regroup with the reserve line. The response that came back, spoken calmly by a voice I did not recognize, stayed with me long after the battle ended. "Negative," the voice said. "We've still got weapons, and we've still got people who need covering fire on this side. We'll fall back when the job's done, not before." The squadron commander did not argue further. The damaged ship stayed in the fight. By the time the human fleet finally breached the staging point shield generator nearly 6 hours after the battle had begun, the Skarn Compact's once formidable defensive line had been reduced to a scattered handful of surviving vessels, most of them badly damaged, several already broadcasting surrender signals that the human fleet, to my surprise, actually honored, redirecting boarding parties to secure surrendering ships rather than simply destroying them outright. "They're taking prisoners," I said, watching the tactical display with a strange mixture of relief and continued unease. I expected, given everything Colonel Rask told us, that they might not show restraint at all. Captain Kess did not look away from the display. "Restraint isn't the same thing as mercy being guaranteed, Kessa. I think what we're watching is a species that decided exactly how far this needed to go, and stopped precisely there, once they judged the threat neutralized. That takes more discipline than simply refusing to stop at all, not less." The final act of the battle came when the Skarn flagship, the largest vessel in their remaining fleet and the one coordinating what was left of their defense, broadcast an open surrender signal across every available channel. I expected the transmission to be directed toward the Coalition relief convoy, toward Captain Kess or one of the other Coalition captains present, since Coalition protocol for accepting surrender was well established and widely respected across known space. Instead, the transmission was addressed specifically and exclusively to the Human Fleet Command. "That's unusual," Doss said, frowning at his console. "Standard practice would be to surrender to whatever force represents the broader Coalition authority, not a single member species." I found myself thinking about that choice for a long time afterward, turning it over in my mind, even as the immediate crisis of the battle wound down around us. I believe, though I cannot know for certain that the Skarn Compact commander understood something in those final hours that the rest of the coalition was only beginning to grasp. Surrendering to the broader coalition meant surrendering to an abstract authority, a set of rules and procedures administered by whichever officer happened to be present. Surrendering to the humans meant surrendering to something else entirely, a promise made directly, person to person, by beings who had just demonstrated, in the clearest possible terms, that their word carried weight in both directions. If humans fought this hard when someone they were responsible for was harmed, perhaps their protection, once extended, would carry the same unshakable weight. Colonel Cole's voice came through on the same channel, moments later, accepting the surrender in terms that were formal, but not unkind, terms that guaranteed the safety of the surrendering crew in exchange for their full cooperation. I listened to the exchange from our bridge, and I noticed that his voice, though still carrying the same exhausted steadiness it had held throughout the briefing hours earlier, had softened at the edges, as though some great weight had finally begun to lift. "Captain," Sura said quietly, once the formal surrender had been logged and the last pockets of resistance around the staging point had gone silent, "the human fleet is requesting medical support be forwarded immediately. They've taken significant casualties." "Send everything we have," Captain Kess said without hesitation. "Every medical shuttle, every supply of emergency equipment, all of it. Coordinate with Lieutenant Bennett's ship for prioritization." I spent the next several hours coordinating the transfer of medical supplies and personnel between our convoy and the human fleet, watching through shuttle bay cameras as coalition medics worked alongside human crews to treat the wounded from both sides of the conflict, including, I noticed with some surprise, a handful of injured Skarn Compact crew members who had been pulled from their disabled vessels and were receiving the same careful attention as everyone else. It was during this long, exhausting stretch of work that I finally learned what had happened at Marrow Ridge in the days before our arrival, pieced together from fragments of conversation between exhausted crew members, too tired to guard their words carefully. The colony's small volunteer defense force, no more than 200 farmers and traders with minimal formal training, had held the line against the initial Skarn Compact assault for nearly 18 hours before the first human reinforcements arrived, refusing to abandon the colony's civilian population even as their own numbers dwindled and their equipment failed around them. I thought of Rask's story again, of the isolated colony that had destroyed an entire invasion fleet 2 centuries earlier with nothing but improvised defenses and refusal to surrender, and I understood, finally and completely, that what Rask had described was not an aberration in human history. It was simply the truest expression of who they were, surfacing again whenever it was needed, whether the wider galaxy remembered the precedent or not. By the time the last of the wounded had been stabilized and the staging point secured, the sector had gone quiet in a way that felt different from the terrible silence that had greeted us at the start of this entire ordeal. This silence carried something else within it, not the absence of an answer, but the exhausted, hard-won presence of one. Captain Kess found me at my station in the final hours before our shift ended, watching the tactical display as coalition and human vessels alike began the slow process of standing down from battle readiness. "You did good work today, Kessa," she said. "I didn't fire a single shot, Captain," I said. "I coordinated supply transfers." "That's not what I meant," she said, and there was something gentler in her voice than I had heard from her in a long time. "You paid attention, you asked the right questions. You understood something today that most coalition officers twice your age still haven't fully grasped, and it's going to matter, going forward, that some of us understand it properly." "What's that, Captain?" She looked out at the display, at the mingled fleets slowly settling into an uneasy but genuine peace, after a day that had begun with nothing but silence and fear, that the humans aren't dangerous because they're cruel, or because they enjoy fighting, or because they're looking for any excuse to prove themselves to the rest of us. They're dangerous because they love the people in their care so completely that they will burn down anything standing between danger and the people they're responsible for, and they will do it without waiting for anyone's permission first. That's not a flaw in their character, Kessa. If anything, it might be the best thing about them, but it means the rest of us had better think very carefully about what kind of people we choose to be, standing beside them. I did not have an answer for that, so I simply nodded, and together we watched the quiet settle over the sector, knowing that whatever came next, the Coalition's understanding of its newest member species had changed forever in the span of a single, terrible, unforgettable day. 3 days later, the Vantage Hold arrived in orbit above Marrow Ridge as part of the formal relief convoy, and I finally had the chance to see the colony itself rather than simply reading reports about it from a distance. From orbit, the damage was visible but not overwhelming. Scattered scorch marks across the colony's outer perimeter, a handful of structures with collapsed roofs or shattered walls, evidence of a fight that had been fierce but ultimately contained before it could consume the settlement entirely. Captain Kess assigned me to accompany a ground survey team, partly because of my earlier interest in the colony's communication records, and partly, I suspect, because she wanted me to see the outcome of everything we had been through with my own eyes, rather than only through sensor readings and status reports. The shuttle set down in a wide field just outside the colony's main gate, and as the hatch opened, I stepped out into air that smelled of dust and smoke and something green and growing underneath it all, the smell of a place that had been hurt but had not stopped living. A small crowd had gathered near the gate to greet the relief convoy, mostly colonists, along with a scattering of tired-looking human soldiers in dust-streaked uniforms, standing watch with weapons lowered but ready. A woman stepped forward from the crowd to greet our survey team, and something about her bearing, tired but unbroken, told me immediately that she had been in command of the colony's defense during the worst of the fighting. She introduced herself as Major Grace Whitfield, and when she shook my hand, her grip was firm despite the exhaustion visible in every line of her face. "You're the Coalition ship that helped coordinate the medical support," she said, glancing at the insignia on my uniform. "We heard about that. Thank you." "We wish we could have arrived sooner," I said, and I meant it more than the polite phrase might have suggested. Whitfield's expression softened slightly. "You got here as fast as Coalition procedure allows. I don't hold that against anyone. If anything, I'm grateful the procedure moved as fast as it did, given how far away you all were starting from." She led our survey team through the colony, pointing out areas of damage that still needed repair, introducing us to local leaders who were already organizing rebuilding efforts with the same quiet, determined efficiency I had come to associate with everything human over the past several days. Children ran between half-repaired buildings, chasing each other with the particular carelessness of the very young, seemingly untouched by the horror their parents and older siblings had lived through only days before, and I found myself grateful for that, even as I marveled at the resilience it represented. Near the center of the colony, we passed a small communications post, its exterior scarred by weapons fire, but its interior, I was told, still largely functional. Whitfield paused there, and something in her expression shifted. "This is where Oliver held out," she said quietly. I turned to her sharply. "Oliver, the communications officer." She looked at me with mild surprise. "You know him?" "Not personally," I admitted, "but I read his status reports for years, before all of this happened. He always added something at the end, a small joke." A faint, tired smile crossed Whitfield's face. "That sounds like him. He kept sending updates as long as the equipment held, even after the fighting started, even after most of us had told him to get to shelter. Said someone needed to keep the record straight, in case Coalition Command needed to know exactly what was happening out here." "Is he?" I began, and found I could not quite finish the question. "He's alive," Whitfield said, and I felt something in my chest loosen that I had not realized was tight. "Took a bad hit to the leg near the end of the fighting, but the medics got to him in time. He's resting in the main shelter right now. Would you like to meet him?" I looked at Captain Kess, who nodded her permission, and Whitfield led me to the colony's main shelter, a reinforced structure near the settlement's center that had served as a refuge for civilians throughout the worst of the attack. Inside, rows of cots held recovering colonists, tended by both human medics and coalition personnel who had arrived with the relief convoy, working side by side without any visible distinction between who belonged to which fleet. Oliver turned out to be younger than I had expected, barely out of his early 20s, with a bandaged leg propped up on a folded blanket and dark circles under his eyes that spoke of days without proper rest. When Whitfield introduced me and explained why I had wanted to meet him, he laughed, a short, surprised sound. "You actually read those reports," he said. "I always figured they just got filed somewhere and nobody ever looked at them twice." I looked forward to them, I admitted. They were the only status updates I ever read that made me smile. "Well, I'm glad somebody appreciated the effort," he said, shifting slightly against his cot with a wince. "Figured if I was going to spend half my life writing routine reports, I might as well make them worth reading." We talked for a while longer, about small things mostly, about his life before the colony, about what he hoped to rebuild once his leg healed enough to work again. It was a strange, quiet comfort, sitting there in a shelter full of recovering survivors, talking about ordinary hopes for an ordinary future, after everything that had happened. I found myself thinking that this, more than anything I had witnessed in the battle at the staging point, was the truest measure of what humans were capable of, not just the ferocity of their defense, but the stubborn, quiet insistence on returning to gentleness and ordinary life the moment the danger had passed. Later that day, after the survey team had completed its work and returned to the shuttle bay to prepare for departure, I found Colonel Ethan Cole standing alone near the colony's damaged main gate, watching the rebuilding efforts with the same tired, unguarded expression I had seen on him during our first meeting aboard the Meridian's Edge. "Ensign Kessa," he said, noticing my approach. "I heard you spent some time with young Oliver in the shelter." "I did," I said. "I'm glad he made it through." "So am I," Cole said quietly. He was silent for a moment, watching a group of children help carry supplies toward a partially rebuilt structure nearby. "You know, I've been doing this job for almost 15 years now. Border patrol, defense coordination, all of it. I've seen plenty of hard days. This one's going to stay with me longer than most." "Because of the scale of it?" I asked. "The number of ships you had to mobilize?" He shook his head slowly. "No, because of how close it came to being so much worse. If Marrow Ridge's volunteer defense force had folded even a few hours earlier, if Oliver had abandoned his post the way anyone would have understood him doing, if the timing on our reinforcements had been even slightly different, we could be standing here today counting bodies instead of counting rebuilt walls. That margin haunts me more than the battle itself did." I considered his words for a long moment, thinking of everything I had learned over the past several days, the history Rask had shared, the battle I had witnessed, the strange, fierce tenderness I had seen in every human I had encountered since this all began. "Colonel, may I ask you something? Something I've been wondering since Captain Rask told us about an incident from 200 years ago, involving an isolated human colony and the Threll." Something flickered across Cole's face, brief but unmistakable. "You know about that?" "Only a little," I said. He said it was kept quiet, out of official records. Cole nodded slowly. "It is. Most humans don't even know that story, honestly. It happened generations before official first contact, to a colony that had drifted so far from Earth's direct influence that by the time we rejoined the wider coalition, hardly anyone connected the two events. I only know about it because of a briefing I received when I first took this post, the same sort of quiet, off-the-record warning that gets passed down through certain command channels." "Do you think it's true?" I asked. "That the same thing that happened then is happening again now, just on a much larger scale?" Cole was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same careful weight he seemed to bring to everything. "I think," he said slowly, "that every species carries something in it, some deep, defining instinct that shows up most clearly under the worst possible pressure. For us, I think that instinct has always been protection, not conquest, not glory, not even survival for its own sake, though all of those things matter too. Just protection, plain and simple, for whoever we've decided belongs to us. It showed up 200 years ago on a colony nobody else even knew existed. It showed up again a few days ago, right here. I imagine it'll show up again someday, somewhere else, long after I'm gone. I don't know if that's something to be proud of, or something to be wary of. Maybe it's both. We stood together in silence for a while, watching the colony slowly stitch itself back together in the fading afternoon light. Eventually, Captain Kess found us there and informed me that our shuttle was preparing for departure, and I said my goodbyes to Cole, who thanked me again, sincerely and without formality, for the Coalition's support throughout the crisis. As our shuttle lifted off from Marrow Ridge and climbed back toward the vantage hold waiting in orbit, I looked out the small viewport at the colony below, at the scattered lights beginning to flicker on across the settlement as evening approached, ordinary lights in ordinary windows, marking the return of ordinary life to a place that had so recently stood at the edge of complete destruction. In the weeks that followed, I watched the Coalition's formal assessment of the crisis move through official channels, and I noticed subtle but unmistakable shifts in how humans were discussed in briefings and reports. The old language, the slightly condescending descriptions of creative but undisciplined tactics, of brave but reckless soldiers, began to disappear from official documentation, replaced by something more careful, more respectful, and, I noticed, considerably more honest. Fleet Command issued new guidelines regarding coordination with human forces during border conflicts, and though the language remained formal and bureaucratic in the way such documents always did, the underlying message was clear enough to anyone who had witnessed what I had witnessed. Humans were no longer to be treated as junior partners requiring guidance and patience from older, more experienced species. They were to be treated as equals, consulted seriously, and, in matters involving the defense of their own people, given the operational autonomy their demonstrated capability had clearly earned. I returned to Marrow Ridge once more before the vantage hold was reassigned to a different sector, carrying a small shipment of supplies that Captain Kess had authorized as a gesture of continued support. I found Oliver back at his post, his leg healed enough that he could stand for short periods with the help of a cane, already back to sending his daily status reports, complete, I was pleased to discover, with a small joke at the end of each one. "Figured you'd want to know, things are getting back to normal," he told me, when I asked why he had returned to the habit so quickly. Seemed important somehow, like proof that we made it through. I thought about that phrase for a long time afterward, proof that we made it through, and I came to understand it as the truest description I had heard of everything I had witnessed during those difficult days. Not proof of strength, though the strength had certainly been there. Not proof of ferocity, though I had seen that too, in ways that would stay with me for the rest of my career. Simply proof that something worth protecting had been protected, against odds that should have made such an outcome impossible, by people who had refused to accept any other result. Colonel Cole and I stayed in occasional contact after those events, exchanging brief messages whenever our respective duties allowed, and I learned, over time, that the Coalition's changed understanding of humanity extended far beyond formal briefings and updated tactical guidelines. Older species, the ones Rask had described as going quiet whenever humans came up in serious conversation, began speaking more openly about the history they had once kept carefully hidden, treating it not as a secret to be managed, but as a lesson worth learning properly, now that the wider Coalition finally understood why it mattered. I think often about that first day, about the alarm that had sounded on the bridge of the vantage hold, about the garbled distress signal and the terrible silence that followed, about Captain Kess turning pale as she gave the order to reach Fleet Command immediately. I think about Rask's quiet warning in the briefing room, a piece of forgotten history spoken carefully in a room full of officers who had no idea what they were about to witness for themselves. I think about the strange, scattered, terrifyingly effective formation of the human fleet as it converged on the Skarn compact staging point, about Colonel Cole standing alone at a display table, gathering himself before the next impossible task, about Lieutenant Bennett's tired, honest answer when I asked her if she was afraid. Most of all, I think about the phrase that came to me almost without thinking, standing in that shuttle bay corridor, watching Cole through an open doorway as he prepared for a battle none of us fully understood yet. "Commander, it's the humans, and they're not happy." I had meant it, in that moment, as a warning, the same way the older Coalition species had always meant it whenever the subject arose in careful, quiet conversation. I do not mean it that way anymore. I have come to understand that phrase differently now, shaped by everything I witnessed in the days that followed, by the quiet resilience of a colony rebuilding itself, by a young communications officer who returned to his post because it felt like proof they had made it through, by a tired colonel who carried the weight of every life under his protection without ever once setting that weight down. When I think of humans now, and when I hear that phrase repeated among Coalition officers who have served alongside them, I no longer hear a warning at all. I hear something closer to gratitude, something closer to relief. The quiet, steady comfort of knowing that whatever threats might still be waiting out there in the dark between the stars, whatever dangers the Coalition has not yet encountered and cannot yet predict, there exists among us a species capable of the kind of love that becomes, when truly tested, an unstoppable force of its own. A love fierce enough to mobilize 1,000 ships in a single day. A love patient enough to sit beside a wounded stranger and ask about ordinary hopes for an ordinary future. A love that does not announce itself until it is needed, and then arrives, without hesitation, without waiting for anyone's permission. Commander, it's the humans, and I have never been so glad to have them standing beside us.